Started. My name is Jamal Binding. I'm the chair of the board of Movement Omaha for Race Equity, which is an organization that deals with anti-racism issue in our community, as well as advocacy and transparency. And what we have today is kind of a special show. Karen Abrams, who is the treasurer of the board, and I'm the chair. We're going to talk about a book called uh, "The Revolution Will Not Be Funded." And I will start off by saying, Karen, first, can you introduce yourself a little bit, and then we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah, Ajmal and I have known each other for 15 years now, and been working on this anti-racism agenda pretty much that whole time. And yeah, I'm on the board of Movement in Omaha for Racial Equity, as Ajmal said. And so one of the things that we've gotten really interested in, we've had several conversations between the two of us about the quote unquote nonprofit industrial complex. So this book, we decided it was time to bring it out into the public sphere, even though it's a little bit of an old book itself. It has so much to say. So that's what we're going to start with today.
Yeah. And as I said earlier, the book is called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex. I've worked in nonprofits for probably about 40 years in various places in the community, so I understand some of this well. Karen's the one who recommended this book to me many years ago, and I had read it way back then. I kind of went back and reread part of it and so on for this conversation's book discussion. We'll raise a series of questions and focus on some of the current and local conditions in our community with specific examples. For some, it may be we're pointing fingers at particular organizations, Nebraska Urban League, the NAACP, Family Housing Advisory, Advisory Committee, Habitat for Humanity, Charles Drew Health Center, which come to mind because of the procedures or leadership and strategic plans, some which lack that, and also lack broad input from our community. It's apparent how they operate. First, Karen, I was going to start off by asking you, what is your overall thoughts of the book and your reaction to the book, particularly, by the way, it is dated, as we said, probably about 10, 15 years old, but still relevant today. But what's your overall reaction, especially for the implications for us in Omaha?
Well, so just an interesting comment about the book is that it's written by a variety of authors. They've all contributed chapters, but the basic theme, from my point of view, is that despite the good intentions of the nonprofit sector, that organizations like ours that are intent on ending racism and achieving other forms of social change, that basically we end up controlling social dissent and repressing, our own radicalism as a result of electing to get funding from local and community foundations. And that changes our mission. And kind of co-opts us. I think co-optation is one of the major themes of the book, that we get co-opted by our funding sources. That's my main takeaway. How about you?
What really surprised me, and I remember reading it way back and back when I was reading as an undergraduate and so on, I read the book, Robert Allen's Black Awakening Capitalist America. And I was surprised as I read it today how much many African Americans and people of color have been co-opted and solidified into the system, assimilated, and become useless to our communities because number one, they get bribed, they have some scandals with them, they've gone involved in some criminal activities, you name it, and they become dysfunctional. So the way they talked about this and used some of his writings that was written at least 15 years ago or more, I was just surprised how it's still true today because again, the ineptitude of many of our leadership and as W. Du Bois called them, the talent of the tenth are worthless, useless, and don't really get involved in helping grassroots and deal with the economic divide. So it was almost like a prediction. And I'm thinking, how come every executive director or CEO who runs a nonprofit doesn't read this so they don't succumb to some of this foolishness and ineptitude and incompetence that's really relevant in many of our societies. So that was the key point for me that I took away. And like I said, I think it'd be a great book discussion to see how much we measure against the narrative or the matrix of this book versus not. So I just really enjoyed that. One thing,
Well,
go ahead, Karen.
I was going to ask you, but you can go first. I'll ask you a question after.
Yeah. Many people in our community, they look at the whole, what they call a philanthropic community, and they say, okay, many grassroots folks are not in systems. You look at their board of directors are predominantly white folks or rich white folks or friends of the system. And some places they make lots of money, like get paid thousands of dollars a year just to sit on these foundation boards and so on. And my question is, how is that possible in light of we're supposed to be trying to help equalize some of the negativity in our community? Don't they see that of having diversity? And again, it's been that way for years, but even locally, I put some serious money down that there's not many people of color of substance and particularly low income or grassroots folks that represent our community. So how can they go that way when some of them are smart, I think, or astute, or smart enough to know that they shouldn't be doing some of that?
Right. And it does seem like there's a revolving pool of board members, especially board members of color on some of these organization leadership teams. But one of the things that I found out from the book, which I guess I sort of had an inkling but didn't really understand fundamentally, is that the the legal purpose of for creating family foundations in particular, was to protect the wealth of very well-heeled families. And so it allows families to basically become nonprofit organizations and not have to pay any taxes on their wealth in exchange for a certain percentage of those assets going to the public good. And the current law is 5%. So as long as a family contributes 5% of its um, family foundation assets, it's following the law and doing what you have to do. But basically, the bulk of its 95% of the family's wealth is protected from taxation.
Wow.
So, I mean, I think that's why we have family foundations.
By the way, inside the book or in one of the chapters, they allude to how the whole system was set up. And what happens is that they get away with paying taxes, then they turn around and do some of the nefarious things that they do with the money, like controlling and brainwashing many of these so-called folks who get funds. But one thing I want to raise also, and again, I don't want to just focus exclusively on foundations, but
Yeah.
the ineptitude, or let's say the collusion of nonprofits. I mean, I can't think of many
Right.
nonprofits where they get money and bite the hand that feed them. And I remember one of our board members said that if you take money from someone, you got to jump to the tune and do what they do, even though you have your own mission. I'm wondering, how do you deal with that so that you don't compromise your mission? What can we do to avoid some of that for nonprofits, particularly here in Omaha? Because most of them, they don't do advocacy. I can almost count on one hand the number of letters I've seen from any of these executive directors who've written about race issues, social justice issues, taking public policy positions. And I'm talking about many of the one people of color that is. But I don't see them doing any of that. And I bet if you go look at their file system, it's like some of them are illiterate. But my question is, how do we avoid that? Even though you talk about foundations, how do we avoid that trickle for nonprofits not to be sucked into that cesspool of ineptitude or not following, helping the distribution of wealth?
Well, I think those are very good questions. At more, what we have chosen to do, as you know well, is to not, to basically not take money, to basically, our budget is under what, 30 grand a year. So we don't have any paid staff. And so we've made a conscious decision to reduce our interplay with foundations and other folks who are controlling the wealth so that we can feel completely free to make the decisions that we want to. But I think this is one of the conundrums that's brought up by the book, which is that achieving, can you achieve systemic change independently without foundation funding? It seems like the folks who wrote all of the chapters are saying, no, once you start taking money from government and from foundations, you are essentially corrupted. And I don't know. I mean, maybe it's the fruits of capitalism. I don't know what's at the root of it. If you're getting a living wage as the result of funding that you're getting from the foundations or government supports, and your revolutionary goals go out the window.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I mean, maybe it's just part of being a cog in the capitalist wheel. What do you think?
Well, and I'm going to switch up and raise that point from a different point, Karen, because I think it's a very powerful question we have to ask ourselves. When you get into position, what is your outcomes? What are your empirical matrix? How have you changed the situation? As one of my colleagues said years ago, you should leave your thumbprint on that organization and make it better than when you found it when you got there. And so, what I want to switch up by raising the point differently is that I even look at elected officials. They're almost like a microcosm of our society. And one time I was talking to Chris Rogers, the county commissioner at Douglas County, and I looked him in the face and says, I don't think district elections has done us any good in Nebraska. You look at the people who get elected, they don't participate with their community on a high level. Now, I'll make exceptions. Some people don't always want to call their names out, but there are some people who are active in the community and on top of issues all the time. But for the most part, you never see them do community forums. I would like to get rid of district elections on the school board. I've never really seen them do anything in the last 20 or 30 years, maybe once or twice, but the school system is in disarray. So not only are we dealing with not lack participatory in a public policy and we call government systems, we're saying that even elected officials elected by district. So when you look at someone who's in a position and they have a nonprofit and you got hungry people and you get this much money, you shouldn't have that problem. And by the way, years ago, I was laughing when they had a legislative hearing and you had all these doctors and medical providers talking about we shouldn't cut Medicare and Medicaid and all that stuff. Well, of course, they were getting their benefits out, but there was no clients or consumers at that table. And I think that reflects what the book talks about, the medical industrial complex, which is a new concept. So I think until we come with some barometers, matrix, empirical data, outcomes, all those kind of things, demographics, we're whistling Dixie. And I think they whistle Dixie in many of these positions. But let me switch up and ask you, Karen, a different kind of question. And I know that you have been in other places and worked with government systems. Is it possible that the government can do right in light of what we're seeing today in terms of distribution of wealth? Because we have the federal government give money, we have the city government, and we have local county governments. But do that money always get distributed to those with the greatest needs from your vantage point, from what you've seen working with Moore and elsewhere? And I also want to reflect back on your work with the city dealing with the planning department years ago.
Yeah, so short answer, it's that's a tough that's a tough call, I think, because look, if you look at the federal government right now, they are the feds currently are making their just outright racism front and center, and white supremacy is ruling the game at the federal level right now. So the idea of taking any kind, taking any kind of seeking a federal grant, um, I just don't see how that's possible. If you look at city government or county government, it's kind of the same thing. You have to look at where those governments are right now, what what the prospects are for the future. We've tried for some county funding in the past, and basically had the money approved, got a grant, and then had it taken away from us at Movement in Omaha for Racial Equity. So you don't know who the players are. You don't have any control of it. And it just strikes me as going from the frying pan into the fire. If the frying pan is family foundations and community foundations, then the fire is county, city, and federal government.
By the way, the money was yanked from us because we criticized Operation Youth Successful. We said from day one when they got started, it was not going to work because of the leadership, the way they structure it, the lack of input from some of the very people who should be giving them input. So again, when they go behind the scenes and go to the crime commissioners directly and say, don't give them money to this group, even though they have a good proposal, that's how the system works. One thing go ahead.
I just wanted to ask you something, which is, we get asked on a lot of grants, for example, who we're collaborating with and, how we can demonstrate that we're working with other organizations and other people. And, a lot of times people will say, well, if you can't do it by yourself, collaborate with some other folks and you'll be able to get the job done. And I'm curious what your take is on that, collaborating with other nonprofits to try to accomplish our social change mission.
Well, I've actually reached out to a number of nonprofits that have similar missions, and they don't return phone calls or letters. And so you can't collaborate with somebody who won't answer the phone. I called Family Housing Advisory about a few weeks ago to find out if I can get access to share some information about the clientele they had at a community forum. And I called about 9 o'clock in the morning, phone rang for 10 times. How can I collaborate? They don't answer the phone. Nobody's working there. Charles Yu, the same thing. Talked to the secretary, the administrative assistant. She said the director, well, Kenny McMorris will get back to me. He never got back to me. I've written him letters. So if they can't get back to someone who's a former chair of their board of directors and help them out of the cesspool they're in when they almost went bankrupt under Creighton, what are they doing for the clients? Again, what I'm trying to say to you is that if they don't have the skill set or the cognitive process, or let's say the intelligence of a amoeba to know how to answer a phone call, again, I know that having been on their board, they had problems. So I'm saying that we cannot collaborate when the system set up to compete against each other. But
Mhm.
secondly, when they start paying these guys high salaries, you got people making 200,000, 150,000, and they can't even know how to write their names. Like I said, I've seen some of these guys and they can't even write a complete sentence, and barely can sign a check. Good thing we got Cash App and that they can probably do that. But what I'm trying to say, Karen, we cannot collaborate with people who don't want to collaborate with you, or they get
Yeah.
hurt feelings because you call them out. And I think that last point I'll say is that when I was teaching a graduate class in public policy, and I asked my students who are graduate students, can we critique or criticize other nonprofits? They said no. The majority of them says hands off. If they're a nonprofit, leave them alone. And I guess that's like the Democratic Party and these other entities. If they're
Right.
not doing well, if we are their friends and we're trying to help them to grow, uh, yeah, they should do that. So I think it's hard to collaborate when the funders put us against each other and they don't incentivize or give us an opportunity to work with each other or give us extra money because we know more than they do because they
Right.
got their degree from a bogus out of town university or some bogus place where they don't really have to read the book and they learn from Cliff Notes. So let me stop there.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. It does seem sometimes like folks are talking out both sides of their mouth when they say, we want you to collaborate, but then there are no incentives for collaborating. Like you were saying, it doesn't make it easier to get funding. In fact, it makes it harder to write a grant together. It doesn't, you don't get more funding if you collaborate. In fact, there's a fear that you'll get half as much or less just because you're collaborating with somebody else who's going to get the other chunk of the cash. And uh, and then there are still, this idea that there are sort of the favorites, the big favorite nonprofits within the nonprofit sector of Omaha. So you have these enormous organizations that have tons of funding behind them and a lot of experience, and um, they can show you talked about outcomes earlier. They've got the money to hire an evaluator to analyze the data and put together an evaluation report that shows outcomes. But if you're a little tiny mom and pop nonprofit, and you're applying for 25 grand, how much of that are you going to use for evaluation to be able to demonstrate that you're producing outcomes? So there's the system itself is skewed, the funding system is skewed.
By the way, two things related to that is in the book, and they very specific that even though they're conservative, some of them, they can be very effective, even being conservative as they advance working with certain groups. And one example might be, I'll say Catholic charities that have maybe a conservative agenda, but they may have a good mission of feeding the poor, or they may have a good agenda in working with the elderly, and they're focused on that. So being conservative liberal doesn't necessarily mean that you're better at distributing resources. What happens, these nonprofits and these foundations start to become much more selfish, and yet they don't follow what they preach. But one of the things that I think is very important is that we cannot ignore. In the book, they have a number of chapters written by Native Americans and different people of color, women's issues, and so on. And each one of them argue about some of the pitfalls they went through and
Yeah.
why they fell into that trap by taking more money and trying to get bigger. But one point I want to raise out, I think is questionable, is that the Nebraska Department of Corrections, again, they say that we start to feed more people into the prison industry and the criminal justice system when you look at law enforcement and the over criminalization of poor people who don't have basic services. Like right in Nebraska, you see Douglas County Sheriff Departments talking about homeless. That's not part of their mission. Get out of it. You need to deal with issues related to staying out of other people's business, but I'm thinking that's something that the homeless people should be dealing with. But their mission is to dealing with a different kind of agenda. So there's a mission creep. And what the book argues is that we just have to go to each one of these segments and say, what's your lane? How can we help you in that lane and not have this bleeding over of like Project Harmony in North Omaha, who has no people staff on their staff. I mean, the people of color on their staff and maybe one or two token on their board. I can call them out because I know this. And so again, these organizations, if they're serious about helping our communities, he's got to get out of that great white savior complex. And then again, if you can't even get the race diversity thing right, you can't get some of these other more complex issues corrected.
I think kind of speaking to the issue of social services and kind of the do-gooderism of the nonprofit industrial complex, one of the things the book talks about is how a lot of social justice organizations that started out wanting to change the
Right,
world ended up being shunted into social service provision and therefore moved away from the essential movement building that was the beginnings of their
right,
of the
right.
work that they were doing. And so it's almost like when you talk about mission creep, it's the organization slowly over time goes from being this grassroots organization by the people, for the people, nothing about us without us,
Right.
to, how can we feed the poor, which is wonderful, but it's not the same thing as building a movement to end racism.
There was when I was at Promise Ship, they had a staff member. I'm not sure of her name now. It's been a while. I'm going to say Brenda, but I could be off. She was a grassroots person who came through the system, was addicted at one time, you name it. And she went through all of it. And she had one of the best reports with staff, clients, everyone. She was worth her weight in gold. And I still talk about it because she was just a smooth operator. It's how she know how to circumvent and go through all these systems to work to help people out. And most organizations don't have someone where they've actually been in that system. When I was on the board of ACLU, one of the things I was advocating for is when we spend so much time in the prisons and prison reform, we should have one of those representatives who's been through that system on our board of directors or on our staff. I think they subsequently moved to that. But it's hard to provide service to someone when you live out on 200th Street or you live in Elkhorn and you never go to North or South Omaha, you've never been to Scotts Bluff, and yet you want to provide statewide services. So Karen, your point is well taken that we got to really start thinking about not only representation proportional if we can, but we also need to think about how do you measure that those people you have on staff are doing their jobs, because again, one of the criticisms I have of school systems, especially the Omaha plantation schools, majority of their staff members are white Europeans. Some of them are daughters of the Confederacy, don't have no interest in the kids. They are out of their Jaguars and their expensive cars in suburban Omaha. You never see them in the community. And in my years at Catholic Charities, I can say of those 25 years, I can remember maybe two or three people from the department who came to a community forum in North Omaha. So if we're not engaging and working with our clients or patients or whatever on a humanistic manner, how are we going to help them to get out of that poverty or get off that cliff effect as is defined so well in our world?
Yeah. Well, and I'm thinking about that, getting on the social movement aspect. Um, if we think about what other organizations in Omaha are working to end racism, that social movement in particular, can you name one other than us?
I can't. I mean, I looked far and wide. I pulled out my binoculars. I pulled out my bifocals. I pulled out my telescope, you name it. And seriously, all I'm doing is saying, show me one letter, show me where you're dressed. I'm not talking about these galas and these front events where you wear bow ties and look like a penguin. And as they say, those miniature ropes you put around your neck. Where have you been to push back at what happened recently about Crawford? I mean, you don't hear a lot from certain people. I'm not talking about certain individuals, but I'm saying the people who are in leadership when there's killings in our communities that are unjustified. And we have the county attorney come out and put 8 cases together, and they do the case probably right before the football game. When the law was first passed, Senator Chambers said you had to call a grand jury, I thought, for each case. What this Don Klein has done, he's put them all in a bucket, and then they all sit in a room, and I guess they pull out straws and say the same thing. Everybody's justifiable. So what I'm concerned is where are those anti-racism in the Hispanic community. One example I use is the Hispanic community outnumbers the African American in Omaha. They have never elected a Hispanic city council person in the history, and the African American communities had at least what, three or four. We can question the integrity and how good they've been, but at least we've had somebody down there who had, looked like us. So these are the kind of issues I think we got to talk about with racism is you got to do the basic count. And I walk in the room and I don't see anybody of color in the room, and they're supposed to be talking about public issues like the crime commission of Douglas County. There's only one black person in the room. I can get up and walk out if I can, but if I'm at work, I got to stay there and listen to drill and talk about whatever they talk about. But yeah, racism is a difficult issue, and a lot of us in systems don't want to talk about it because we feel if we be colorblind, we'd be more like Trump.
Yeah, and if you think about, the last grassroots organizing that was happening in Omaha, I feel like, I mean, could it have been, do you remember Acorn?
Right, way back in the Acorn, you also had, Old Talk was a
Uh-huh.
lot front and center with the public auditor. I don't hear them saying do anything on race in the
Right.
last, what, since Tom Holler left.
There's get out the vote efforts. We have lots of get out the vote efforts, which is a kind of organizing, I guess, but it's not grassroots. It's not that old-fashioned Saul Alinsky grassroots organizing.
Right. And we tried to denigrate Saul Alinsky because he was very effective. And again, I must give credit to the conservatives because they've been planning stuff for years behind the scenes and plotting and planning. But, like I said, even the Democratic Party, I look at the two people who are running that, is it Kleb and Precious? I have never seen one letter from them addressing racial issues on a decent level. And it's hard to run a Democratic Party from middle Nebraska when you've never been to some of your bases in North and South Omaha. Look at Senator Fisher. I've never seen her in my life in the community anywhere. Ricketts, I know he's come out and had some food at the Ethiopian restaurant because the owner told me that, and he knows a few of the people who are handpicked. But I don't see the Fisher, who's from Western Nebraska. And so going back to your point, we got to really deal with that. We got about a minute or two before we open it up. But one thing I found fascinating about the book is I never heard of the term called the medical industrial complex.
Hmm.
That was fascinating. I know I heard the prison industrial and I know school to prison pipeline, which the OPS is perfected because all I do is go to Lincoln and see all their graduates. Let me back up this. Oh, don't I don't mean that to be disrespectful, but they're really good at training our kids to go down there and make license plates. But again, push back at me if I'm making this up. They don't have the demographics of what happened to their graduates. But the medical industrial complex really blew my mind because I didn't know that they had such a control over the medical apparatuses that a lot of the poor people don't get basic health care because it's about profit and money. And if you don't have the money or the means, you can't get in it with all these cuts that are coming down. There are going to be a lot of people going to die prematurely. And I don't know where Douglas County Health Department is at, Lancaster, all these folks. I don't see their data. And again, I'm calling them out on it. But if you're serious, how do you have a public health department that never goes to the public? How do you have a public health department that never invites community members who have the students to help educate many of your monocultural graduates how to be better practitioners and health providers in a community as diverse as Omaha? Karen, we got about a minute before we open up. Anything you want to say or something you want to throw out related to the book or anything before we open it up to the audience?
Well, I guess I just thought, maybe we could talk about our own definitions of, what do we think is meant by that phrase, nonprofit industrial complex. And it's something that, we can throw out, but maybe it's worth saying what that means to us. And I was thinking about it a little bit. It's kind of like an unhealthy an unhealthy symbiotic relationship between nonprofits and then between nonprofits and our funders. Um, and that creates a system that tears us away from our missions for social um, activism and dissent, and then ends up controlling us through our own, agreements for funding.
And Karen, I'll add to that. We sometimes focus on nonprofits in the community. We don't focus on higher education. They're just as complicit in this same crap too. I have not seen many academicians involved in social justice over the years. I don't know what the Black Studies department looked like. I know one or two persons there, but I've never seen them engage in anything, particularly Black Studies, Latino studies. And I remember we did our report on the discrepancies in terms of hiring and students at UNO. We sent that letter, hard copy letters with our 78-cent stamps on them, to probably over 20 people of color in key positions. We heard not one response from one academician, even though many of these folks have tenure. So we don't want to let academicians off the hook with their studies about esoteric, a certain mouse in Australia or something, because many of them, if you look at the criminal justice department, I've never seen them do anything about some of the issues. And there was one African American female who did one, and then I think they ran her out of town and she went elsewhere. But you don't see a lot of academicians helping us with some of the grassroots issues. And I would love to see an organization to do a little bit more of that and engage and push back of us. We shouldn't be have thin skin when some people are suffering in our society and our communities. We're right up on our point of opening it up to the audience or people who are participating, and want to give you a chance to share and push back at us if we've said something that it was ouchy or whatever. But this is the time if there's some common conversation things you want to have. We have a
You
number
can,
of people out.
you can put comments in the chat if you prefer, or just, we've got a small enough group, you can unmute and just share your thoughts.
One thing I just want to say, I had an opportunity to be on the advisory committee of the Project Harmony, and I find them disgustingly pathetic in the way they interact with the African American community. But when I was there, they had so many police officers in their building, and I know there is child abuse, but I think are we over criminalizing some of the issues where we pull people into that system because of poverty? And are we have a sense of fairness in child welfare? Because again, if you look at the foster care review office, you look at the kids in the juvenile justice system, they're about 98% black and brown kids. And so my point is, at what point do the system say it's not passing the smell test, and then maybe we're doing something wrong? I heard from somebody today that that kitty jail down there is still empty, $20,000 or whatever they spend a month or whatever to keep it up, and there's nobody there. So they did a bait and switch, and they knew they were lying when they started it. Because again, they use some ARPA funds and other funds to get it there. But why do you build a building that no one can come in? Is it like make cake and they don't get to eat it? So again, we all have some challenges and skin in the game on how we can help correct some anomalies in our community. And I just find it sad in the child welfare system, we got some of the same flippant, stupid behaviors that we should be trying to work ourselves out of jobs. And that's not going to happen if we don't engage communities to help educate them to grow and maybe stop doing some maybe dysfunctional things that get them caught up and get a traffic ticket because you don't get plates or something because you worked at Metro at some point, whatever.
Thoughts, questions?
Karen, one thing I was just going to say, I would love to see a study group read this book, dissect it to the point we take part of it apart and say, how can we start a new coalition or group who, number one, can read a book from cover to cover, because a lot of people only read Facebook. But secondly, pick a part that appeals to them and do it not only because they get paid, but because they want to make our community better. And again, I question, we got United Way with all this money they've been philanthropic for years, and the numbers have not really decreased in terms of poverty, particularly the series they did probably about 20 years ago in the World Herald. And we got all these new immigrants coming in. We got ICE coming in, all this stuff. So I would just love to see this book used as a template to do some self-assessment, some reflection, as they say, some meditation, and just say, hey, either we do the job or we don't do the job, but stop playing footsie with low income and working class people who have challenges in our community. And also the same thing with government systems. When I was in Douglas County, I was surprised how many people have never been outside that building in North and South Omaha. I mean, you can probably count them on one hand who even drove in that direction because they usually got on the interstate and shout out to suburbanites or wherever. And again, I don't care where you live at. I'm just saying at some point in your career, paint a house or volunteer once with your church or faith community, but I don't see that.
So while we're waiting for somebody to pipe up, and still you can just unmute or you can type something into the chat. But while we're waiting, I wanted to ask you, Ajmal, um, did you come away from your reading of that book with a decision in your mind about whether or not taking money from foundations and other sources of grants um, controls social dissent?
If it's small, I mean, if you're getting like 10,000 or you're getting a small amount, they give it to you for operation, or they give it for infrastructure for an issue like helping you build a better computer or something of that nature. But they should put their toes in the telling your board members and staff what they have to do when your mission is pretty locked in. And I use Catholic Charities for example. When the state came back at them, told them they had to accept homosexuals or gay or LGBTQ plus so on people as adoptees for kids, they said, we don't want anyone in your money. And they walked away. They have a right to do that as a church entity. They even have a right to let somebody like Algebra, who's a born again certified atheist who worked there for 25 years, we got to let you go because we don't share your faith now. And we figured out that you're an atheist. It took a long time. You got to talk about it all the time. But that 25 years, we got to let you go because we don't have money in our budget. Give me a break. But organizations can up to a point. But I do, you're going back to your point, you have to have that up front, or as you should say, they have a group in town that was going to deal with reparations around there and everywhere but reparations. It's a joke. I knew the organization was going to be up front when I looked at the director, I looked at the people who came into town, and they have no advisory committee. You cannot do reparations doing all this other stuff that is not directly to the concept. You're circumventing the process. So I'm almost sure they called him in, sat him in a high chair, gave him the choice between the red and the blue pill, and they took the wrong one. And all you see them down in City Hall yakking about stuff that has no outcomes to help our community. And again, they're thin-skinned, but I think once you start taking big money and you don't want to lay people off, and I talked to a couple of directors once, and they said, "Oh, Jamal, I would like to be much more outspoken, but I don't want my staff to go without income and their families to not have to, have food and shelter and make their car payments and so on." So I understand that, but I also think you need to be clear up front that when you take money from certain entities, as one board member said, you have to dance and tap dance to what they tell you to tap dance to.
There's also the issue that it seems to me one of the, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like another one of the themes from the book had to do with how over time, a lot of the responsibility for carrying out social good in communities has been turned over from governments to foundations. Uh,
Wow.
and so as a result, what you have is non-elected people who are, predominantly white run family and community foundations that are making decisions about social change in this little tiny group of unelected people.
Right.
So if so that's kind of a danger, even if it seems like they're on our side in terms of the decision making, the decisions that they're making, to have a really tiny group of unelected folks um, deciding who gets what, when, and where. I think that's, we need to get back to government funding public health, for example, rather than family foundations.
Well, Father Harvey, I'm sure first it was Steve or Tom Hart, but he was the head of Catholic Church when I first started in 1983, and I went to a workshop or a retreat in Sioux City, Iowa. So, and what was fascinating, what he said, he says, as a Catholic agency, we want to be the ambulance or the rescue squad for the poor to help them out. We want the government to see us front and center because we're closer to them through our food pantries, our Ballard, William, and so on. And he basically said it in so many words, government, uh, but he said the church cannot be a substitute for government. We don't have the income. We depend upon the charity of good people who are Christians or whatever their faith is to help out, but the government taxes us. And I find it ludicrous that, again, we sometimes expect foundations to do what the government should do. I
Yeah.
mean, if you look at all the silly, frivolous stuff that I saw when I worked in county government, where they're using a nonprofit, I'm not going to mention their name, to work with youth, they didn't even apply for the money, they just got it. And again, we make decisions who gets money based on friendship, who we play golf with, and so on. So we got to be careful not to put too much burden on private entities who got their money through slavery and profiteering and all the stuff that happened in the 30s and the 40s with Union people, how they shot people in Denver, you name it. The book alludes to all that. So they got money by ill-begotten goods. And when
Yeah.
they sit up there like a fat cat, like they worked hard for it when they got slave laborers and had people working in their kitchens for nothing, just like Amazon. And so my point is we got to keep putting pressure on elected officials to make sure the money is not going to the pet project like pig farmers in certain parts of Nebraska to help their situation out. And, they got all kinds of sweetheart deals. So I just think that let's be careful not to throw too many arrows in one direction when reading the book. There's cannon, there's enough arrows for all of us, including those of us who are complicit with our own demise. Some of us, we just suck up and we just can't be numbers. Yes, I'm boss. I just want to be on this plantation. And Harry tell me, say, I'm gonna help you get off. Even Sir Jordan Chu talked about it, but you know how some of us are. We just can't get away from being and shucking and jiving and being in these systems just because we're comfortable or we want to drive the car we drive. And again, those are issues, Karen, we got to start asking ourselves in this community, or else.
Sounds like you're saying if you go to bed with white supremacists, you'll wake up a slave.
Well, you know what I find sad is that we have slavery in this society in different variations, including the raw stuff that still exists, and even the way we treat some of these migrants and people who are trying to get away from persecution from Central and South America and throwing them in jails and putting them on uniforms with stripes like they're in a concentration camp. And all these so-called good people are quiet. Again, those of us who know history know that we have to say something. When they fired those crematoriums, there were some of those good Germans that said they didn't know where those ashes were coming from. And so we have the same mentality when you got ICE people, the FBI, the CIA, and all of them shooting people in the middle of the ocean when they haven't had a trial. And those things are wrong. And I say that because, again, I'm in a position to say that, and no one's going to look over my shoulder and say, oh, Jamal, you can't say, because we have freedom of speech. Curtis told us that, right? You get to say things you need to say.
Paula has something to say. She
Oh,
said, I think the point about academicians is a good one. You would think that with the emphasis on outcomes, that the scholars should be interested in developing a data collection system to identify goals, identify strategies, and monitor implementation. The problem has always been that the universities collect demographic data, but often doesn't measure the meat of what needs to happen.
wow. Paul, I appreciate that because that reminds me of when I was on the board of, I want to say, Family Foundation, one of the organization, off of, now I forget the name a little bit, but they had a social work professor at UNO, heard her, I'm not sure of her last name, been a while. She did a wonderful community assessment. It was one of the best I've ever seen and had all the data, survey. I mean, it was done meticulously. It was just dynamite. It was almost like a textbook version of a survey where it included a cross section or some sample of that. After she finished, she presented to this organization, and I asked her, what are you going to do with this? Is she going to play a role in helping them implement? She said, no, they paid me my 5,000. I'm walking away. I said, but I don't think they have the skill set to do the next level or drill down. And subsequently, nothing happened with it. So, Paul, one of the things that I'm sensitive to is that we got to get more researcher. And again, when someone has skill sets of AI and all the stuff they get and they spend time using government funds to get educated and also to teach and we subsidize them, we should get some little payback where they come in our communities and help some of us who don't have the skill set. And I remember, I'm not going to mention the name of the person because I don't give the person homage, but you used to say in the meetings, those who are closest to the problem are close to the solution. So if you have people who have come off the welfare or some kind of disability, whatever, and they become successful, bring them into your folds and have them have educate other people or train or engage with them how they did it. Because sometimes we come through, and I tell the story, I was technically poor until I was like maybe 27, 28 when I got enough increase in my salaries that I didn't qualify for government housing or food stamps or whatever. I had a couple of kids and a wife. And I tell people I had a college degree from the University of Lincoln, political science and all that stuff. But some organization would hire me because I'm eligible. I'm not going to mention the Urban League or Wesley House, and they would hire me. But you know how that is when you're a young man and you're full of fire and your family's an advocate. They just see you as not doing it. But Paul is a great point. We got to get more academicians to come in our community and share their service learning group and people in our community, help the people who are in trouble. And I think a lot of people don't want to be in trouble or be at the bottom, but they need help. And some of them don't come from families where they have a mom and dad and support system, uncles and aunts, and some do. And so I have to be careful when I try to blame the victim because we do too much of that with this present administration. Other feedback, other comments.
Nomi says, how can nonprofits collaborate, enable, or amplify the role of college students who are ready to protest or share their perspective?
Wow, that's a great
This
question.
It is a good question, and I think for more I can say it's been a challenge. It's been a real challenge for us to connect, even though we have tried through service learning projects to connect with students, to bring them into the fold, and have occasionally had some really good experiences. I mean, we've had some excellent students who've helped us out enormously, but mostly we don't seem to do a great job of connecting with them. Eh, Nomi, if you want to unmute, I would love to hear any suggestions that you might have about how we could do that, or where you're seeing, where you're seeing students who are wanting to share their perspective with nonprofits, for example.
Karen, I will say I've reached out to College of St. Mary's. They've rebuffed us to do some partnership on race and engaging their students. I've actually talked out there a couple of times. I see they have some gaps in their system. Back in the day, Creighton used to invite different people on the advisory committee. Father Morrison, who's late now, had a wonderful advisory committee of all kinds of people representing different parts of the city. The president doesn't do any of that. He brings in, the high hitters and put them on the board who again help him raise funds and build an infrastructure of a megalomaniac university, but they have to bring in the people in the folds inside the classrooms, in the service learning programs, and everything that they do and learn both ways. I mean, again, we don't go out to teach the people in the villages can teach us. And so let's reverse the paradigm and let's make it a didactic or make it a kind of a reciprocity dance so that we can all have epiphanies. And I think we're not going to have epiphany if we stay clustered in our own ivory towers, or if we have universities that don't know how to go into North or South Omaha or go into East Omaha or whatever. So we just got to do a better job of that. But some of the students are only going to follow what the faculty and the administrators do. If they basically turn a blind eye or say they don't want to help our communities, then those are part of the issues we got to push back and call them out on it.
Nomi, I saw you on mute. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I went to the University of Lincoln, Nebraska, and we had an African Union, which was uh, mostly Black Americans and also Africans from the continent. So I know sometimes, this was years ago, but we didn't partner with any organizations at the time, but we did a lot of protesting with just on campus. But I think that that would be a good start to go to the African Union. I don't know what Omaha has, University of Omaha or Creighton, but they do have some certain, you know, or union of Black students or Mexican union as well, or
Yeah.
Hispanic union rather. So those, as a president, that's probably there's a couple of presidents that's actually active there. So maybe reaching out to those guys and they would probably get excited about collaborating with a nonprofit and having you guys' leadership that would help them, you know, push you guys' agenda, which is probably similar as with their agenda too.
Great. Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
By the way, somebody told me who works at the university that they've scrubbed their websites and dealt with getting rid of the multicultural affairs, anything that deals with race and diversity, because they get so many federal funds that they are afraid of losing their federal money under this present Trump administration. So it become deracialized or whatever. But I've heard that happen at the University of Omaha. Lincoln, I don't know what they're about. I don't have anybody down there of contact. But I do know when there was a multicultural affairs, there was a couple of directors. I think one of them might be over at Metro that I reached out, didn't reach back. I mean, I wrote letters to all of them, say, how can we collaborate with them? And again, I can go back and pull my letters out and show you that there was no response. And sometime I send them emails. So again, even though we reached out to them, it's a reciprocity thing. If they don't reach back to us, Normie, you cannot have a dance. I want to do a two-step, but I can't do it by myself if they're going to just be stuck in the corner, being a wallflower, and not doing what some of the basic issues they purport to do in their missions. someone has here, oh yeah, the federal funding cuts could be the potential problem now. Yeah. And the medical center is a good example. I participate in some activities where they scrub some words and I'm like, you can't say that. Use some dog whistle words. Geographic areas, North Omaha, South Omaha. We know predominantly who lives in those areas. Rural areas, you can use that. But even then, you still shouldn't have to back off of calling people who they are. I mean, again, do I look like a white woman with blonde hair? I don't think so. So just because Trump doesn't like to use race or he wants to become a racist on how he does stuff, I don't have to call down to him. You know, he got elected. He's supposed to serve the people. But I'm just surprised at how many people in this country are letting him get away with the stuff he does, including the Supreme Court. Karen, I was going to ask you, and I know you've been in different cities over the years and you've traveled a little bit. How do you think it's going in other cities you've seen? Are they having some of the same problems you think we're having in Omaha from your travels and your experience of being around in different places? I know you went to France at one point, so you know it's like across the ocean. But what do you think this whole Trump is in this issue we're talking about? How do you think it's affecting our world, global community from your experience, not only nationally, but even internationally?
I think I don't know, there's going to have to be sort of like and again, I hate to call it a come to Jesus because like you, I'm an atheist, but I think the
Wait,
nonprofit,
wait, are you coming out in public like Oswald does? I don't have heard you do this in a long time. We got to go to IHOP and have an international breakfast and have some special seconds and go some services. Go ahead. Sorry.
we need a come to Jesus for the nonprofit sector because I think that, when I think one of my big takeaways from this book is that we need to get back to basics, really, as social movement builders and as folks who are really trying to move the needle on social justice. And, we want to foment dissent, not push down in our press our own outrage and our own work to make change happen. So it seems like it is hard right now. I mean, there's a lot of um, hand wringing and sort of learned helplessness and hopelessness about what's happening at the federal level in the United States. And, I am 100% federally funded, my job right now. And so I am forced, if I am, as long as I decide to keep my job, I am forced to work at the will of really damaging and nonsensical decrees coming down from on high. And it's painful, it's pitiful, it's all I can say is it ain't good. And I think I can't speak to what's happening in France, but they're having their own problems with emergence of right-wing governments, and I think that's it's kind of, it seems like it's an international issue. So how do we get back to movement building is going to be a common international question. How do we get back to our roots? How do we get back to um, building anti-oppressive movements from the ground up?
One thing you just said that you work or have money coming from the federal government. I also have money coming from the federal government. They call it Social Security. So I don't think they can take that away from me after all the money I put in there. But what I find unfortunate is my late wife worked for many years and she passed away where she did not get 1/10 of what she put in there. And it's in this ether that's used to fund the ICE agents. And so I would love to have them make sure that federal money that we put in as low income working class people goes to our heirs or someone so that they don't misuse it to bomb some innocent Venezuelan people in the middle of the ocean who haven't been committed, who have been having justice. But the other point I think is probably the most important for me is all of our lives, we work for organizations. Our bosses and you name it, supervisors tell us what we can and cannot do at work. And some of them are so arrogant, they tell you what you can do when you leave the office. You say something, you see people getting fired for brazen Kurt's name in a certain way. When you get on Social Security and you get an income of pension that's guaranteed for life, some of us old fogies or those of us who are over the hill should be speaking truth to justice and help these young people understand you still have constitutional rights and freedom of speech. Again, if this person can say what he says and get away with it, and in so many words in our public square, and you just make some comment and quote him, you should lose your job. So I'm saying we got to get folks who are in a position where they can speak truth to power and nobody's going to hurt them. And again, one of our former directors at Catholic Church USA shared me, Sharon Daly says, when I challenge the church or people, they can't do nothing to me because I'm protected. I have like tenure in my job. So she says the people who
Right.
don't have tenure, they have to be scared. But those of us who can't protect the most vulnerable from the marauders,
Yeah.
and the good shepherd has to protect that one sheep. And we got people who are running around acting like sheep, like they're afraid to speak out. So if you're retired and you don't have to answer anyone, you should be on the front lines helping protect those who come behind you. Because again, we all come into this place unfettered or just as innocent lambs. And again, we go out
Right.
wise and hopefully a lot more knowledge we can share with younger people. And I think older people got to step up to the plate more so and stop being sitting around not doing anything, especially if they have the ability to do that. We're about
Right.
5 minutes left. Any other
Also
feedback?
came off
Right.
mute.
Right. So I think one of the things I would like to add to, as a person who has recently uh, cut the chains of W-2 lifestyle. So I have my own, obviously, law firm that I run. But I think the issue too is that I find it that there is a level of racism to say white people or people who are of not of color get to say and do what they want, but we have to wait until we're retired or we are in these positions where we aren't employed to say and do what we want, right? So, and I see that all the time with some of the work I do is that if a black person or a person of color says X, it's an issue, but if a white person says it, it's not an issue, right? And in order for us to protect or insulate ourselves, we have to be of a certain age, and at that point now we're quote unquote bulletproof. Well, that's an issue to me, right? Because we should be able to speak freely, whether you are 18, 19, 20 years old, or whether you're 65, 70, or 90 years old, right? And I think of all the individuals who have done so many things in terms of progressing the movement, all those individuals are younger than me. Malcolm X is younger than me. Martin Luther King is younger than me. All of those individuals, Harriet Tubman, they're all younger than me when they were doing what they were doing. Nat Turner, younger than me, right? So it's about the young individuals pushing this agenda. And if they don't push this agenda, you know, we're not going to go pretty far.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, I'm thinking about Juanita Johnson when she used the word smartass to describe one of the incompetent administrators who was acting silly or stupid. And the next thing they jumped on her for using that word. And when I worked in county government, I heard so many cussaholics and words used by people. And I didn't know you could use the word BIT like it was a regular word. I mean, I hear all kinds of stuff in the workplace and they didn't correct each other. I saw a cussaholic who were professional. As my sister once told me, there were some people who in high level jobs who could outcuss the gang members, she said. So what I'm point is, sometimes when we say stuff, we're held to higher standards. And this is one of the issues we got to make sure is that barometer is the same. And that's where we need the legal system to be fair and just. Because again, when you have somebody like Don Klein, who is totally obviously a right-wing Trump supporter and mentality level that there was no fault with any of those shootings. He just threw them in a basket and they pulled each one out and just, put their toothpick in like the thing that happened down in the South when the guy was lynched, those kind of things, So we got to come back and we got to challenge it again. You can't have the few doing the work of the many. And like I said, I would love to have proof of these so-called leaders show me correspondence and engagement of the community. And also, it's arrogant to try to do stuff without doing it in a group. Boxing, like Crawford, that is a individual sports. Civil rights to social justice and work is a team sports. You can't play football with one player. You can't play basketball with one player. We've seen great players lose their
Right.
team because they try to be individuals. So, Pocho,
Hmm.
my point back to you is that we got to learn to come together. As Malcolm said, our greatest problem is unity. And if we dislike each other and we can't work together, we're forced to suffer and have that pinch shoe on our toe. We're
On
down
that
to our
note,
last minute. Any last points?
did you want to talk about any upcoming programs?
Well, we're going to interview somebody from Inroads coming up. And then one of the things we'd like to do is we really want to encourage people to start reading books. And you're going to have to do self-education because it's obviously an education institution in the Omaha Plantation School, and the inept board members are not dealing with reducing those disparities. So we got to work with literacy. And one of the things we got coming up is an event this Saturday about Black history in North Omaha. And we like to have as many people come out and engage in conversations about the great things that have been done in Omaha and North Omaha that is not taught in our education institution. And people who come to our wonderful city don't know how many groups have contributed to this city and been involved in social justice. So we're going to have Adam Fletcher Sass share his book. And we hope we get a lot of people there to kind of engage and hopefully become a springboard for us to engage community more, because we're a small organization, but some people think that we are a multi-million organization considering some of the stuff we've done in the past few years. So
Where
we hope
can people find out about that? Moreomaha.org?
go to more.org, and then again we're going to provide lunch, and again the time is from 8:30 to about 2:30, just in time you get out and watch the Nebraska football game. So we were conscious of that, so we set it up. So we look forward to seeing some of you there, and again tune in and give us suggestions on how we can improve more and improve some of our programs. And we always end on this note: may the force be with you. Baroko.
Thank you, everybody.